So this is Matthew 2, the visit of the wise men. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on to their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, and going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet Hosea, Out of Egypt I have called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. And then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. When Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream to the district of Galilee, where they went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. So does it make sense what's going on narrative-wise and where this takes place as far as Matthew's goal, right? We spoke about last time when discussing Matthew 1 that Matthew has a geo-apologetic focus within these initial chapters of his gospel. So apologetics, what is that? Apologetics is the study of defending the Christian faith, right? So presumably Matthew is writing to an audience of hyper-educated Jewish readers at the time who would have been as immersed and as familiar with the Old Testament as Matthew himself would be, with Matthew being a Levite, right? He's a super educated one at that. So context-wise, that's what's sort of going on. And then before I move on, I want this to be as interactive as possible. So to the extent that you guys have questions, that's what we're here for. So basically, if you weren't here last time, we spoke about at length, how do we interpret the scriptures, right? And one of the best ways you do that is by understanding the historical context in which the scriptures arose, right? So for Matthew is probably getting secondhand traditions from other Christian communities within this Second Temple time period of Judaism. With that, he's also writing to historical Jews, right? Jews who would have been present post the resurrection of Jesus and might have had questions about whether the Jesus they heard of or even might have witnessed is the actual Messiah, right? So that's really one of the main larger purposes one of the larger themes and purposes of the Gospel of Matthew, right, is to convince a very stoutly Jewish population within Palestine to understand that the Messiah has come, right, and that all these Old Testament prophecies have been fulfilled. The other thing I just want to quickly say is to the extent that you guys can take notes on this, all of this is gold. All of this is gold. And this is not simply pat myself on the back or do anything along those lines, but this is carefully prepared, right? I will be circulating these notes, but I think as far as our understanding of the scriptures and the text that is in front of us, you're not going to be getting this in your typical church environment, right? That being said, we can get into the context of Matthew 2. So last week, before we did Matthew chapter 1, we spoke about how do we interpret the Bible, right? And one of the best ways we do that is by trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the audience for which these scriptures are being written for, right? This is a foolproof way to sort of really engage with the text, right? And that is the project we have in front of us, is to engage with the text, and thereby doing to extract meaning out of the text, right? We're not reading into the text, but we're extracting meaning out of it, right? There are certain things that sort of in this American cultural environment and being 2000 years set apart from some of these events that are written down for us, there are things that we just simply wouldn't be aware of. And one of these things is just who was Herod, right? So Herod the Great, this is the Herod that's mentioned in chapter 2, and right, goes on to essentially do an infanticide, right, to kill infants in this kind of satanic plan, which is also referenced in Revelations, where John, the disciple, is speaking about this serpent attempting, in a vision-like context, but attempting to murder the Messiah, right? And then it's this miraculous gush of water that saves Eve, presumably representing and being a stand-in for Mary, and they flee, which is exactly what happens in this chapter. So who is, as in Revelations, who is the physical manifestation of the devil attempting to rid the world of its coming Messiah? This is Herod, Herod the Great. So Herod the Great is a Roman client king who rules between 37 BC and 4 AD. He's a Idumean, which is New Testament, a kind of New Testament phrase for an Edomite. And so if we remember in the episode of Jacob and Esau, right, it's pretty clear to us that there is to be an eternal conflict between the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau, right? Those who descend from Esau's line are to be eternally in conflict with the nation of Israel. And this goes on to David's time, right? Which is what some of the Psalms are about, right? When David asks the Lord to crush his enemies for him, right? He's referencing a very particular set of people who have surrounded Israel, and if it were up to them, would destroy God's covenant people. So that's really what's going on. And because of that, because Herod is not a Jew by birth, right? He's set up, propped up by the Roman Empire. And just for those who aren't aware, Palestine at this time, when we say Palestine, we mean Israel, the historic nation of Israel in which Jesus would have lived and walked. Palestine or Israel was essentially occupied by the Roman Empire in this point in history, right? And this has been the case, and this was the case for hundreds of years, the time of Babylon as well, right? So Babylon is a sort of monolithic Persian massive empire, which also destroyed the temple, right? The temple that Solomon created, essentially took Jeremiah and his cohort, which is an Old Testament prophet, into slavery, into exile, right? So Israel has a history of being under occupation by these nation states, most often because of their disobedience to the Lord. That's really the narrative structure that we see in the Old Testament. So before I continue, does that all make sense as far as background? Do we need to pause? Okay, so I'm assuming we're good. So again, who is Herod? He's a king. He's a client king set up by the Roman Empire. Rules between 37 BC and 4 AD. He's half Jewish, right? The other point we should keep in mind is during the time of Jesus and during the time of his disciples, there's this persistent thread of political incoming political revolution, right? So you have even the sons of thunder, right? The sons of Zebedee, the two disciples who ask Jesus, will we be able to sit at your right and left hand, right? Which part of it is we want to be honored as one of your original 12, but it also goes to show we want to be warlords, right? We want to be fighters. We want to have an honor which correlates to a kind of earthly violence against those who have taken our land, right? So that kind of hopeful political incoming revolutionary air is really what's going on in terms of historical context. And so Herod being a half Jew, right? He's not even Jewish, right? He's an Edomite, which is the cursed, long lost brother of Israel, who was not descended from Jacob. His rule was never taken well, right? And we can envision, and as we'll get into, Herod is a kind of pharaoh figure. Even the mention of the infanticide, which is the killing of infants in pursuit of his attempt to destroy the savior or someone who will be a real king of Jews, right? And this is what drives Herod's insecurity in the earlier verses. Beyond that, Herod was also a ruthless ruler. So amongst the people he had murdered before he passed away included his wife, several of his own biological sons, numerous relatives, as well as thousands of prominent citizens within the kingdom of Judea, as well as their supporters all at once, because of psychopathic tendency. He was sick towards the end of his life, and he wanted people to come to his mourning. And to ensure that, he wanted to kill hundreds of people at once to make sure that the entire nation knew that he was gone, right? This is the kind of person that happens to be ruling Israel at this point. So essentially Pharaoh on steroids, right? Another interesting point is that he was also a master builder. So he spent a lot of tax money within Judea to rebuild portions of the temple. And so I think Matthew just goes to this level of detail to pinpoint there are people on this earth as we speak, not just Herod, right? But moving forward with it. There are people who are not disturbed even by episodes like these of infanticide or murder, but who will have bloody hands in touching things that are sacrosanct, right? This is the dialectic that we see in Matthew chapter 2, right? Is that it's the Magi, right? We all know, we're all familiar with the infancy narratives of Jesus and how these pagan magicians, right? The word in Greek is magios, right? It's a magician almost. It has this astrology-like connotation to the word. And it's not just early Christians, but early Jews would have had a massive hesitation with any kind of association with people like these, right? So historically, they would have been Persians from the Babylonian Empire and a kind of a Zoroastrian, this kind of dualistic, Gnostic type religion, which has nothing to do with the Abrahamic religions as we know them now, right? So the fact that Matthew is setting up his narrative in a way that elevates those who come from a pagan narrative, a pagan religion or culture, and he tends to emphasize the way in which people who, like Herod, who have blood on their hands, as well as the Sanhedrin, right, which is the highest Jewish civil religious authority in the land, and the fact that both church and state are aligned, especially for those Jews who knew the Old Testament, right? This is the dialectic that's going on in Matthew, and this all goes to support his universalist agenda, right? Matthew's agenda is universalist. So we spoke about in Matthew chapter 1, where Matthew goes out of his way to essentially include non-Jews who are Gentiles, people who don't have people like Ruth, who was not a Jew by blood. All these people, and also people like in Genesis 37 and 38, like Tamar, who indulged in prostitution because she knew the Mosaic law, right? All these questionable characters and questionable narratives, Matthew is not afraid to pull in because his agenda is universalist, right? The gospel includes all. It is for all. right? So this is the kind of a narrative context and narrative structure that Matthew is using for a theological purpose. So before I continue, does that all make sense? Is that helpful as far as context? And any questions so far before we move on? Okay, so if I don't see anything in the chat, I'm assuming we're good. So that's Herod. That's the king. This is the pharaoh-like figure. We're going to get into some of the more Mosaic typology. So Mosaic meaning like Moses, and typology meaning a study of types, right? So when we say typology, we're studying the scriptures as they reference each other or as they foreshadow each other, right? So there are ways in which Jesus is a new Moses, but there are also ways in which Jesus fulfills the Mosaic covenant in a way that Moses failed to do, right? That's what we are trying to do. The other thing I want to call to your attention is this biblical meta narrative of an unholy king, right? So, for those who are familiar with the Bible, and for those who are familiar with ancient Egyptian culture, within ancient Egyptian culture, Pharaoh and pharaohs were considered God, right? They were considered the closest manifestation of Ra, right? Of the sun god, of God himself. And Herod is sort of seeing himself in a similar light here, right? Throughout the Old Testament, throughout Genesis, there's a massive, massive connotation of taking life, right? The Lord in the early chapters of Genesis says those who spill blood, their own blood must also be spilled as well, right? There is something holy to blood, and especially that of human beings. So the fact that Herod is steeped in Jewish culture, the fact that his family accepted Judaism, the fact that he's Jewish by proximity, and the fact that he is not afraid to stoop down to the level of murder, let alone the murder of innocent children, right? Because of his political insecurity and because he's aware that he himself does not have the right in the way that Jesus does to be a Davidic, David-like, figure and king of Israel. What does that say about his character, right? And how does that connect him with Pharaoh? That's the kind of connection that Matthew is trying to spell out for us in this description of this infanticide narrative. So does that make sense? Meaning, when we interpret the scriptures can be interpreted in a pattern-like way, right? We see Pharaoh, we see figures like Pharaoh, we see figures like Herod, we also see figures like Nimrod, right? The purported king, who is also Mesopotamian. Babylon is within Mesopotamia, who constructs this Tower of Babel, which is what? It's, excuse my language, but the Tower of Babel is a middle finger to God, right? That is what it is. It is essentially saying, God, you will come down to my temple, right? Or we will construct something to see you, right? And the humorous way in which Moses, who's the presumed author of Genesis, is that the Lord had to come down to see what they were doing at the Tower of Babel, right? It's a joke. But in its being a joke, it's not any less disrespectful to our Creator, right? So that's really the political context that Matthew is sort of dealing with as he's writing his gospel. I don't know to what extent you guys are familiar with some of the early narratives in Genesis, but if we remember Cain and Cain's murder of his brother Abel, it's only a few generations after Cain, right? That, he inevitably has a son named Lamech, right? And Lamech brags to his wife, I believe this is Genesis, but Lamech brags to his wives that he has killed a man for disrespecting him, you know, as far as words. His words are that he's given them sevenfold vengeance, right? And Jesus flips this in the Gospel of Matthew, as we'll later see as we continue our series. But Jesus flips this and says what? You are to forgive your enemies 77 times, right? So we see this pattern also encapsulated in the political change within Herod's dynasty, right? So Herod passes away. An angel, as we saw, as we read, approaches Joseph and says, those who are seeking the child's life have died, right? Herod has died. His son, Archelaus, takes the throne. And just as we see the murder, just as we see in the Old Testament, how the murder of Cain is multiplied, is worsened throughout the generations, we also see the cruelty and the political lack of empathy that Herod had multiplied even more so in his son, right? So this is why the text, this is why Matthew has Joseph say that he was afraid of Archelaus, right? Towards the end of the chapter. Joseph is wise, and he's also privy to this understanding that leaders tend to get worse with time, not better, right? And so as Christians, I think what Matthew is doing is placing our hope in our true king, right? That's really narrative wise what he's trying to do. Okay, so that's context wise. Hopefully that was helpful. And then we'll just parse this verse by verse. So I spoke about in the prelude to our discussion that Matthew has a geo-apologetic focus in this chapter, right? So apologetic is what? To defend the faith, right? To explain the faith, to intellectualize the faith. So Matthew, as a Jew himself, right, who would have been steeped in the Old Testament, who would have understood all these Old Testament prophecies and how they relate to the coming of the Messiah, his attempt here, especially in verse 1, right, what does it say? So just read this here quickly. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, right? What is his mention of Bethlehem? And what is his mention of the land of Judah, right? We spoke last time in Matthew chapter 1, Judah, for someone to be or have a qualification to the claim of the Davidic dynasty, David's line, you had to be from the tribe of Judah, right? So the fact that he's inserting this early in the chapter is him attempting to prove to Jews and early Christian communities at the time that Jesus is indeed, he has a profiling, right, to be the Messiah that he claims to be, right? So that's what's going on here. And then moving on to verse 2, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. And then verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And assembling all of the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, again, going back to this Old Testament prophecy piece, right? That the Davidic king, this Messiah, must be from the tribe of Judah, are by no means among the least of the rulers of Judah. And for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. So what do we see in verse 3, right? We spoke about Herod's psychopathic tendencies, his deep political insecurity of not being a Jew, right? Of not having the same claim that this coming king who would have come from the line of David, who would have had a rightful claim to the kind of authority to call himself King of the Jews, right? And surprisingly, we see this phrase towards the end when Jesus is defending himself in front of Pontius Pilate, right? Pontius Pilate calls him the King of the Jews in the kind of satirical sense. But we see Herod's insecurity here, right? This is the point. Herod was alarmed, right? And what Matthew includes is all of Jerusalem with him, right? It's not just Herod who's surprised at this. It's not just Herod who's unsettled by this. It's also the Jewish elites, right? It's also the Jewish elites, which goes to show that merely having access to the scriptures is very different than understanding the scriptures, right? Or being transformed by the scriptures, right? The fact that the Sanhedrin, the civil, religious, legal structure in Palestine, in Israel, is so subservient to the rule of Herod and will get up and tell him all this information just at his bequest. Matthew is painting a very, very stark picture of what the church or of what the covenant people of God can be when they subject themselves to things other than God himself, right? or when they subject themselves to people or persons who prostrate themselves as God, right? This is the political tension that Matthew is trying to get across, right? And this is something we'll see throughout the rest of the book, throughout the rest of his gospel, is that there is an intrinsic tension between that of the kingdom of God and that of the kingdom of the world. And until Jesus comes back to set us free from this, this is something we'll have to simply go through as human beings on this side of heaven. So this is the tension. This is what is at play. And moving beyond that, we also see this tension between the Jews, and the Gentiles, right? We have this phrase, the wise men, or wise men from the East. Narrative wise, I think we should think to ourselves why Matthew has these pagans, right? These non-Jews be one of the first people to witness the coming of the Messiah, right? Why is it not a group of Jewish Magi, right? Or Jewish elites? But what we see here is that the Jewish elites are on the side of Rome, right? They're on the side of empire, right? They're on the side of human striving, as we saw it in the Tower of Babel, right? And again, right, this goes to Matthew's universalist agenda, right? What is the gospel? What is the gospel? The gospel is the good news, right? It's the euangelion, right? Literally good, you, like euphoria, and angelion, angelos, angel, messenger, right? It is the good news or good message. And that good message extends to all, right? It extends to all peoples. It goes beyond the precipice of simply Israel or simply the covenant people or simply the physical descendants of Abraham, right? We also have this concept in the New Testament and in Matthew and in the Gospel of John that they're spiritual descendants of Abraham as well, right? This is what Matthew is setting us up to understand, right? In all these infancy narratives and this early part and early period of Jesus's life. So does that make sense? Do we need to pause? Are we good for questions? Otherwise, I'll compile whatever is in the chat towards the end. So, okay. So on these magi, right? Who are these mysterious, unnamed figures who witnessed the birth of the Messiah? So the magi, like I mentioned before, comes from the Greek magios and the East. So Matthew's a Jew, right? He's writing from the perspective of the West Bank, where Israel currently sits, right? From the perspective of Palestine. Babylon is the only, or Persia, right? Or Iran is the only nation that really fits the bill. So presumably these magi, these magicians, right, are coming from Persian, right? The Babylonian Empire. So we spoke about Rome, right? We spoke about how Palestine is under subjugation of the Roman Empire. So I think Matthew is doing something really interesting as far as having these three figures who have come from a former oppressor of the nation of Israel and the people of Israel and the Jews. The fact that former oppressors, right? We spoke about Jeremiah and we spoke about some of these Old Testament prophets who were exiled by, right, Babylon, who were exiled in Babylon for a number of years in their history. The fact that it's former oppressors who are some of the first people to witness the coming of the Messiah also bleeds into Matthew's universalist agenda, right? And we can conclude the same thing when Jesus blesses Roman centurions or Roman soldiers. What does this say about his aim, right? As savior of all, right? As savior of all. Even those who oppress you, right? Jesus has come to save. Even those who once oppressed his people, Jesus has come to save, right? So keep that in mind, and also keep in the back of your mind how Herod reacts to the coming of the Messiah and how these pagan magi react to the coming of the Messiah. So behavior-wise, what separates the two? This will come up later. The other thing I'd like to call your attention to is the prophecy of Balaam. So we have this here, the prophecy of Balaam, Numbers 22 through 24. Just to jog your memory, Balaam is a foreign, he is a non-Jewish prophet who essentially takes the side of the nation of Israel when his king that he reports to King Balak as attempting to destroy Israel in a sort of military conflict. So how does this connect here? Matthew is pointing to this prophecy in Numbers 22 and 23 when he, in this very phrase, the wise men from the east, right? So you might ask yourself, how is it that these Persian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian Magi, astrologers, dream interpreters, have any idea where the Messiah is, even with the help of their astrology and them seeing something special in the sky to lead them where the Messiah is being born? It's probably because of the fact that these Babylonian captors, right, these Babylonian oppressors, when the Jews were in captivity, they definitely would have shared some of their scriptures. And one of the scriptures that come up, the connection that Matthew is making, is this prophecy of Balaam. And this is because Balaam is supposedly, in the Old Testament, he's described as a visionary from the East, right? So this is the connection that Matthew is making, is that in this, the Magi, the three Magi who are at and present during the birth of Jesus Christ, they fulfill the same role that the prophet Balaam, who is a non-Jew, right, who is from the East as well, who is a visionary, who sees dreams, who interprets dreams, this pagan prophet who is not part of this covenantal group of people, this nation that we call Israel, they both have taken the side of the Messiah. They both have taken the side of the covenantal elected people of God, right? They have not bowed down to the king. And this is what we'll see in further detail later in the chapter, where the Magi, they see a dream and they know Herod wants information from them as to where in Nazareth, where in Bethlehem Jesus might be, right? And they don't bend the knee, which is telling because the Sanhedrin, right, we see in verse 3, all of Jerusalem was upset. All of Jerusalem was in waiting, right? All of Jerusalem was urgently waiting in a bad way, not in a good way, not rejoicing as the Magi do when they see this Messiah in front of them. They leak information to Herod so that Herod might get his way in murdering his people's Messiah, right? So already Matthew is setting up a dialectic between how these pagans, right, behave and how they eventually take the side of God's people and God's will and God's planning, and how Herod and the religious elites, right, the scribes, the interpreters of the Old Testament, how they react to this coming of the Messiah, who inevitably, right, would have shaken things up as a rightful heir of, the throne of David, right? Because it's not just Herod who should be in fear for his political seat. It's also these political elites, right, who sit within these high priestly Jewish families. Presumably, they get some kind of financial compensation for bending the knee, right? So this is what gets them upset, right? This is what is at stake for them. And this is why they behave the way they do. But then again, this goes back to Jesus' saying, right? What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, but to lose his soul, right? This is what is at stake here. This is what they've sacrificed for comfort, for earthly comfort, right? And this is a theme that we also see further in Revelations, specifically chapter 12, where Jesus is commending the saints, right? He's commending the believers who have come after his death, Revelations 12, verse 11, and those who did not fear for their own lives, right? This is the kind of follower that Jesus wants, right? Those who are not afraid to say no to authority for his sake, right? This is a question of allegiance. It's a question of allegiance, right? Who do you ally yourself to, right? And who do you fear? We see in the later half of the chapter, we see Joseph fears Archelaus, right? But that's a rational fear, right? He doesn't want his family to be martyred before the timing is right or before it makes sense to do so. That being said, his fear of the Lord, right, presumably, and the Magi's fear of the Lord are far more real to them than whatever fear they may have for Herod or the Roman Empire, right? So it's a question of allegiance. So this is one theme that Matthew is going to develop further and further throughout his gospel. So does that make sense so far? Is that helpful? and we can move on. Okay, good. So, and then let's just take a moment to speak about the gifts, right? So we have, this is verse 11 and 12. So the Magi, continuing halfway in this narrative, the Magi fell down and worshiped him. So, and then, it continues, verse 11, and then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. So, typologically, what do these gifts represent? So, gold and two angels seated at the holy seat, right? Covering, reflecting the Lord's glory back to him, right? It's gold. Frankincense, what does that represent? Frankincense, according to Mosaic law, according to Levitical law, is one of the only kinds of incense you can burn for religious purification purposes at the altar, right? So it's a spiritual gift, right? It's not just perfume, though it can be used for that. There's a religious connotation to the gifts they're giving to Jesus. And then myrrh. Myrrh is tonic, right? So what we see here is on the one side, there's theological meaning to their gifts. And on the other side, the Magi with the gold, right? The gold could have been used as money. The Lord is sort of setting up their future travels in their fleeing of Israel, fleeing from Israel to Egypt for a safe haven so that Herod doesn't get his way in murdering all these infants just out of fear of having a political competitor. The Lord is on the one hand, there's theological significance to the gifts they're giving. And on the other hand, there's providential accuracy in the Lord knowing that they will have need for these things. They will have need to make sacrifices, or they will have need for the gold in their travels. So this is divine on both sides. So that's what their gifts imply or what they mean. And then finally, in First Kings, this is going back to the point of gold. So I'll just read it quickly. I'm reading from the ESV. This is First Kings 10. So First Kings, remember what Matthew is calling here, specifically with this gift of gold, is the Queen of Sheba. So who remembers this Solomonic tale, this tale of Solomon and his rise to glory before he eventually fell into his many wives and worshiping different gods. But before then, in his glory, in his wisdom, he was approached by kings, queens, presumably by the Queen of Sheba, with gifts as a sort of representation for his wisdom and his righteous standing with the Lord at the time. So this is what the scriptures say with the Queen of Sheba and her eloquent and just beautiful objects and gifts that she's giving to Solomon towards the beginning of their relationship. So this is First Kings 10. Now, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices and gold and stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. So this is what Matthew is also referring to when he has these magi, when he's recounting this story, this narrative of these magi bearing gifts, bearing gold. David bears his son, Solomon. So Jesus is necessarily related to this family, to this dynasty as a Davidic king, as we saw in chapter 1. But as we see later in Matthew, in his gospel, Jesus literally says, something more than all of Solomon's glory and splendor is here. This is what Matthew is referring to, what he's setting us up for. Is that a king wiser, stronger, and more ethical than Solomon himself in all of his glory has come. And the Magi, who are pagans, are the first one to realize that this is what is being done, right? That this is what God is doing on earth. So that's a sort of reference here with the gifts. It's not just providence or theological meaning. It's also Matthew is continuing to reference all of these Old Testament narratives and completing them. Jesus is a complete Solomon. He is a Solomon who will not and cannot fall into apostasy. He is a wiser Solomon. He is a Solomon who is more Solomon than Solomon was. This is what is being referenced here. Just for your notes, very similar ideals can be gleaned from Psalm 72, Psalm chapter 10, as well as Isaiah chapter 60. We read First Kings 10, the first 3 or 4 verses. And then we also see this connection that Matthew is making, that Matthew is referring to in all these messianic prophecies of the fact that the Messiah will come in glory, but it's not a glory that we expect. It's not the glory we prescribe to human kings. It surpasses that. And this is what Jesus word for word verbatim says towards the end of the gospel, towards the end of this gospel of Matthew, that something has come far more glorious than Solomon in all of his splendor. So this is the Lord we worship. And then we'll just revisit Herod, I think. So we spoke about Herod. We spoke about his political insecurity. Going back to Herod, we spoke about Herod and we spoke about his sort of political insecurity in driving some of his motivations. He hears the scribes. Whenever you see the word scribes in the Old or New Testaments, this typically means those who have authority within the Jewish synagogues to interpret the scriptures. So in these early verses, when Matthew is speaking about these Jewish authorities being in the presence of Herod or his court, he has the very people who would have determined mainstream interpretations of the Old Testament, right? These were the people you go to who dictated how do you interpret Mosaic law, maybe, 1,000 or so years post Moses, right? Those are the people who were in control of that process. So the fact that Herod, who also is a Jew, right? Herod is also a Jew, mind you, right? His family converted were Jewish converts, despite his lack of, genetic Jacob-like heritage. He is a Jew, right? And he's allied with the Sanhedrin. He's allied with the synagogues. He's allied with all of these Jewish elites who also would have had these interpretive powers, as we spoke about. So the fact that Herod, right, going back to his infanticide, his killing of infants, later Christian traditions, when I say that, I mean the early church, right? So say anywhere between 100 to 200 years after the ministry of Jesus Christ, some of these early traditions have these numbers of this infanticide in particular to be in the thousands, right? But archaeologically and historically, we know that the town in which Jesus was raised definitely had less than 500 inhabitants at this time. So Herod would have murdered no more than, let's say, 20 to 50 children, young male children under the age of 2. That being said, the fact that this doesn't disturb him, the fact that the loss of life in any way or any capacity does not disturb him, goes to show how he views religion, right? So I have this prepared, this quick reading. Hauerwas, Stanley Hauerwas, he's at Duke Divinity. He's one of my favorite theologians, definitely one of the most preeminent, who's alive and who's still with us today. But this is what he notes about the relationship between politics and religion within contemporary culture, and I think he connects it super neatly with Herod's relationship with religion. So this is what he says. He says, Herod is not as powerful as he thinks. Herod is king only because it pleases the Romans to have him rule over this troublesome region. Herod is a pawn used by Rome to maintain order useful to Rome. Jesus is born in occupied land, a small outpost on the edge of mighty empire. And Jesus is eventually killed under Rome's authority, and at the time, his death will mean nothing to Rome. How could Rome know that this man would be the most decisive political challenge it would face? Rome knew how to deal with enemies. You kill them or you co-opt them. But how do you deal with a movement, with a kingdom whose citizens refuse to believe that violence will determine the meaning of history? The movement that Jesus begins is constituted by people who believe that they have all the time in the world, made possible by God's will and God's patience, to challenge the world's impatient violence by cross and by resurrection. Too often, the political significance of Jesus' birth, a significance that Herod understood all too well, is lost because the church, particularly the church in America, reads the birth as a confirmation of the assumed position that religion has within the larger framework of politics. That is, the birth of Jesus is not seen as a threat to thrones and empires because religion in today's world concerns only the private. This view does not intentionally downplay the importance of the gospel, since it assumes that private dealings are one of the most important in life, but the Gospel of Matthew knows no distinction between the public and the private. Jesus is born into time, and thus he threatens both Herod and Rome. Does what I read just make sense? Basically, his point is that Herod does not understand the difference between church and state, right? And this is not an American idea, right? For Herod, religion serves the state. And if we're honest with ourselves, for most evangelical Christians, religion also serves the state, right? So what does Matthew's theology have to say with how we view ourselves in today's world, right? It's something we should think about. Religion, our faith is not merely private, right? It's not a mere private matter. It is a public statement, right? It is a public statement of your allegiance that you will go all the way, right? As those that Jesus commends, right? This is Revelations chapter 22, right? We have these sin lists. Like whenever you're reading the Pauline epistles, the letters of Paul, you have these lists where Paul will say X, Y, and Z people will not enter into the kingdom of heaven, right? Liars, the murderers, all these people, all these kinds of people will not enter the kingdom of heaven. The last sin list that occurs in the scriptures is that in Revelations, is that from the very mouth of the Alpha and Omega of Jesus Christ, who we call Lord. And the first item in that sin list is the cowards, right? This goes back to Revelations chapter 12. Those who did not fear for their own life more than the quality and the authenticity of their witness for the sake of the church, right? That's what Jesus is referring to directly there. And I think this is what Hauerwas is trying to exposit here. And what Matthew is trying to exposit here is that our allegiance, right? You do have chapters or you do have places in the scriptures like Romans 13, where Paul does seem to have a kind of positive vision of the government, but that vision is very narrow, right? It's very narrow. What Paul says in Romans 13 is the only way in which any government can have any kind of claim to legitimacy is its purpose and its function as being a sword of God to reduce crime. That's his argument in Romans 13. Therefore, if that's true, right, and if Jesus is requiring us to suffer for him, as we see in Revelations, in the same way that he has suffered for us, what does that say about the kind of allegiance we have to the kingdom of heaven and the kind of temporary allegiance we have to governmental institutions above us, right? This is the theological divide, right? And it gets even more clear when we go into the Gospel of Luke, who has it's eschatological tension, meaning you have this phrase in Paul that essentially describes there's a division in time itself, right? So there's the time to come and the time we're in right now. And these two are represented by two different, and these have theological meaning because we're not in heaven, right? Because Jesus has not come back, there's always going to be a tension between these two kingdoms, right? And this is what Matthew sets up his gospel for, to explain and exposit, right? This is not to be a political revolutionary in any way, right? Because, like I said, there was this revolutionary spirit, this violent spirit rising amongst the nation of Israel during the time that Herod was alive, not just because of his cruelty and his indiscriminate killing of his own citizens, but also because of this long period of history, this long waiting period, this intertestamental period, which is around 400 years, in which this sentiment is growing, right? This angst, this anxiety is growing. Why do we not have our own claim to land that was given to us by God, right? First it was Babylon, now it's Rome, why not now, right? That's the question. And Jesus's ministry does a lot to quell a lot of these anxieties, right? Jesus is not a political king, right? He's not a warrior in the same way that David was. Despite the connections there, and despite his claim to the Davidic throne, he's not a killer in the same way that David is, right? At least for now. That changes when we get into Revelation and we see John describing Jesus's just, his righteous anger towards those who have been deceiving and murdering his own people, the saints. But we don't see that quite yet in Jesus's character during his earthly ministry. So my comments have less to do with political sentiment and they have more to do with allegiance, right? So this is going to be one of our main questions for today is who do we ally ourselves to, right? When it comes down to it, when we speak of Jude, right, the book of Jude, Jude has a very, very strong term. It's a super short book. If you have time, read it. But when you look at the Greek, Jude is essentially throughout his book encapsulating this idea that a loyal soldier does not die with his shield on his back, right? So what does this mean? In ancient Greek culture, right, when there were all these warring city-states, for you to put your shield on your back means you're trying to run away as fast as possible from the battlefield, right? You've put your sword there, you've hitched it back on your back, you've put your shield there, and now you're just trying to run away, right? This is the analogy that Jude is using, and we'd be more cognizant of it. You know, we as Americans understood some of these cultural connotations, but that's what he's referring to, right? And this is what Jesus is referring to. This is the theme, right? Jesus is looking for a very particular kind of disciple, right? This is the mark of a Christian, a little Christ, right? In the same way that Christ did not back down for our sake, right? Despite his blamelessness, despite his innocence in front of Roman Empire itself, in front of Pilate himself, he did not back down, right? And this is perhaps made even more human, and perhaps we can connect this to the incarnation, right? When he's praying in the garden, he says, let it not be my will, but your will, right? He's speaking to the Father, right? This is the kind of witness that Matthew is setting ourselves up for within his gospel. And this is the tension, right? Until Jesus comes back, there will always be a tension, right? We are not at war with entities of flesh and blood, right? Is what Paul says. That is the tension. This is the kingdom to kingdom, kingdom of man to kingdom of God, right? The kingdom is at hand, right? It's here in a way, but it's also not here in a way, right? We're not in heaven yet. We do have the Holy Spirit, but these things haven't been fulfilled. This is the tension. So on the one hand, there's kingdom to kingdom tension, right? On the other hand, there's tension within the fulfillment itself, right? Within the time to come and the time we're in now. So that's biblically speaking, when you read the New Testament, not just limited to the Gospels, but when we read Matthew, when we read Luke, when we read John, and when we see these things at tension, that's what the gospel authors are trying to call our attention to. It's a question of loves. What do you love, right? What do you prioritize? It's a question of priorities. Do you fear for your life, right? Or as Jesus says in multiple gospels, that he who loses his life will gain it in the next. And he who attempts to keep it will definitely lose it in the next, right? That is a tension. So that's one tension we spoke about. And the other tension I think we've covered so far is this tension between Gentile and Jew, right? Those who have the scriptures but don't understand them, and those who don't have the scriptures but do understand them, right? And this goes into the gospel, the heart of the gospel, right? As it being a message for all. Theme-wise, that's what I want us to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the gospel. Okay, so I think we've covered this on the Magi. Hopefully this makes sense. The other thing I just want to bring your attention to is that there's this idea of Mosaic typology. So Jesus is a Moses-like figure. On the one hand, there's this connection of infanticide, right? In the same way that Herod is attempting to wipe out God's deliverer, Pharaoh also during the time of Moses attempts to wipe out God's coming deliverer, right? So there's a connection there. This is what Matthew is calling our attention to. Jesus is more Moses than Moses was, right? In the same way that Jesus was more Solomon than Solomon was. What I mean by that is towards the end of Moses's life, you all might remember, Moses gets very angry, extremely angry with the people of Israel because of their lack of faith, right? They ask him for water, they ask him for food, and then he says, "You infidels, you faithless people, you infidels, here's your water." And he smashes his rod on the rock, right, to give them water. The reason why the Lord is upset with him, and the reason why Moses does not enter the promised land after this episode, is because Moses did not credit God where credit was due, right? This is why the Lord was upset with him and why he prevented him from entering into the promised land, and why Moses had to pass on his mission to Joshua. Jesus is not that, right? So despite these Mosaic connections, there are ways in which Jesus has fulfilled this Mosaic typology, right? He is an intercessor. When we think about who is Moses, right? Who is Moses? Moses is a high priest, right? He's a king priest. He's a priest king, but he's also an intercessor, right? The Exodus narrative talks about Moses as a man who spoke to God face to face, right? This is Jesus, but he has this access 24/7 on the one hand, and he's not subject to his emotions in the same way that a human intercessor like Moses was, right? So there are all of these little connections that Matthew is drawing our attention to, which I think makes his gospel unique. It has theological and devotional significance for us, right? We're in better shape having a Jesus than we are having Moses, right? This is clear. The Davidic line, just for those who are taking notes, I'd write down Micah chapter 5 and 2 Samuel chapter 5. This is the specific prophecy that Matthew is referencing in verses 5 and 6 of Matthew chapter 2. So again, Micah chapter 5, 2 Samuel chapter 5. Micah chapter 5 and 2 Samuel chapter 5, when we look at verse 5 and 6, essentially what Matthew is doing is he's combining these two messianic prophecies in one, from Micah and from Samuel, and he's describing Jesus. The context of these original prophecies, the original context, as that Jesus is on the one side, he's a shepherd figure. He's a shepherd. He's a good shepherd, right? In a way that Moses was not, right? Moses had anger issues. Moses is a murderer, right? Moses is a murderer. Let's not forget. So Matthew is pointing to the good-hearted nature of Jesus as a pure shepherd of his people on the one hand, and he's also pointing to the humble beginnings, right, of our Lord. So when we speak of Bethlehem, right, this is verse 6 in Matthew chapter 2. "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means among the least of the rulers," right? There's this theme, there's this motif within the Old Testament that this final Davidic Messiah will come from a town which no one has heard of, right? And we see this in Zechariah as well. We see this in Zechariah chapters 9 through 11. So if you have time after we're done, I would read that if I were you. But the whole point of Zechariah chapters 9 through 11 is that this coming king, this coming Messiah, will be humble. He will be flowered, right? He will be honored. He'll be, we see this in Isaiah as well, Isaiah 49 and 53. But he's humble in a way that we didn't see in the Mosaic narrative, in light of him murdering someone, in him taking the authority to murder someone, even someone who's oppressing his own people, right? So my point here is that there's a way in which Jesus is a final Moses, right? That Matthew is trying to point to. And his use of prophecy only goes to show this. So I hope that's helpful. And going into this, right, what happens when Herod takes office and kills all these infants? The family escapes to Egypt, right? So the connection here, again, is a kind of reverse exodus, right? Exodus literally meaning to leave, right? To escape. It is a reverse exodus. So why is it a reverse exodus, right? If we're not aware, this reverse exodus story, the story of Jesus and his family and Joseph leading the family into Egypt, this is unique to Matthew's gospel. So the question then is, why does Matthew include this narrative element in his story? I think this goes back to our idea of the gospel being universalist, right? So we spoke about former oppressors, right? Babylonians, these Babylonian dream interpreters coming from a far off land to give honor to this king that they have no idea of. Even though the word worship is there, if you look at the Greek, that word can be used to giving respect to an earthly king, right? So it's not clear from the text itself that these Magi would have known that Jesus is divine, that Jesus is God incarnate. They just would have been aware, probably by the help of the Holy Spirit and these kinds of things, that something special was going on. But they're probably not aware as far as the gospel message itself. That being said, why does Matthew include this sort of reverse narrative where Joseph is leading his family into Egypt, where Egypt has historically been, number one, a massive pagan center of magic and ritualistic magic at that, something which the early Christian and Jewish communities would have been very uncomfortable with, right? And two, a place that was a former place of oppression, right? A place of mourning for the people of Israel. The reason why he's doing this goes back to the very point, the very reason why Matthew includes these pagan magi in his narrative, in his story. It's this idea that the gospel is open to those who oppress as well, right? That love cuts through all, right? This is his point. And then there's this Old Testament reference in Hosea chapter 11, which Matthew directly quotes in verse 15. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. So if you read Hosea chapter 11 after we're through, this is essentially Hosea, the Lord, through the mouth of Hosea, explaining how he's been disappointed in the behavior of Israel, despite his continued sanctification and his continued efforts to keep them out of the hands of foreign kings. And so the point that Matthew is making is Yahweh, if the Lord, Lord of hosts, has saved Israel, who is a terrible, in terms of an analogy, right? And this is the analogy that Paul uses. But if the Lord is husband to the nation of Israel, corporately speaking, as a group, Israel is an adulterer. Israel is adulterous, right? And this is what Hosea, by way of his prophecy, this is what the Lord is speaking through the mouth of Hosea, is that my wife is an adulterer, right? She's not loyal to me. So Matthew's point here in verse 15, 16, is that if the Lord has done this for a cheating spouse, then what will he do for his son, right? What will he do for the second person of the Trinity who was there during creation itself, who shares the same nature as the Father, right? And I just want to pause there because that is a pretty deep point. I don't want to overlook that. So the point here is not only is Jesus a true Moses, but Jesus is also a true Israel. Jesus is a true Israel, right? He is the true Son of God, right? And that phrase in the Old Testament can be loose. There were the sons of God, right? We see this in Genesis and elsewhere. But we only capitalize that which refers to Jesus Christ of Nazareth, right? Because he has fulfilled the Mosaic covenant in a way Moses himself could not, right? He represents us in every way. He is our intercessor. He is our intermediary. That's the theological point Matthew is trying to get across here as well. It is because Jesus is the final representation of the people of God. That is precisely why the gospel is what it is. That is precisely why his penalty and his sacrifice on the cross is effective. That is why it is effective, because he was Israel, right? He is the true Israel. That's the point here. That's the point. That this is the backdrop of Jesus' ministry, is that there is a true representation, a true vicar of God's blessing and authority on earth, and it is found in Jesus Christ. And because of his sacrifice, we may all be restored in a relationship with our God because of his perfectness, right? Because of his perfection. That's the point here, that Jesus is the true Israel and that Israel has fallen away, right? And despite that falling away, it is because of that falling away that Gentiles like us might be engrafted onto this Israel. And it is because of his perfection as the final Israel, as the final Adam, that he can represent us in this. If we give an analogy to it, it's a court case, right? That's what Judgment Day is. It's a court case. And he's paid the price for us so that when we walk into court, we can walk with our heads high, right? Luther, the founder of the Lutheran denomination, right? One of the early Protestant reformers, Luther says, sin boldly. This is what he told his students, sin boldly, right? And repent even more boldly. And why is it the case that we can sin boldly as Christians and not not feel as though our relationship with God is based on some sort of condition, right? This is the very heart of the gospel, right? It is an unconditional message. The reason for this is because the one who is perfect and the only one who might be perfect has died for us, right? This is the point Hosea is making. This is the point Hosea might even not be aware that he's making, but this is the point Matthew is definitely making, right? It is a gospel point. This is the gospel, right? This is what he's trying to get across. And this is what he's setting us up for to read as we see Jesus teach throughout his ministry and into him sending out his disciples into the world. So does that make sense? And then we'll just end here. I'll include all that which we didn't cover towards verses 23 and Matthew's use of so that he might be called a Nazarene. It's a play on the Hebrew, but I think we'll just end here. So we'll end with Jeremiah's lamentation. So this is verses 18, 17 through 19. And then this was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. And then he quotes Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. So obviously Matthew is using this very particular set of prophecies from the prophet Jeremiah in his sort of recapping of what's just happened in all these murders of these children as Herod is pursuing, the death of a political rival, right? If we remember, right, we spoke about Jeremiah and his place within this Babylonian exodus where the people of Israel are in Babylonian captivity, right? And this is Jeremiah was there, right? Historically speaking, prophesying about this in Israel, speaking to leaders to make sure everything was okay. This is the place he took historically. That being said, if you look at where this prophecy takes place within Jeremiah's book, Matthew's use of this verse in particular is very peculiar. And this is because this verse in particular is one of the only depressing ones throughout the chapter, which means if you remember Ramah, so what is Ramah? Ramah was a place where the Jews were gathered before their march towards their exile, towards Babylon. Jeremiah is actually released here and he unsuccessfully tries to persuade some of the leaders. And so what Matthew is doing here is he's connecting Jesus's narrative to a future Jeremiah-like role in which he himself has escaped exile, and in his ministry, he will unsuccessfully appeal to the religious elites. So this is why Matthew includes this prophecy here, is what he's saying is Jesus will take the same role that Jeremiah has in this prophecy in trying to attempt his kindred, his brethren, right? As far as what the Lord is requiring of them in this moment in time. So as we've seen, Jesus is a Solomonic figure, right? He's a Mosaic figure, and he's also a major prophetic figure, right? He does all three, which makes Jesus' ministry unique. So Matthew's use of the Old Testament is super interesting. This all goes to show and serve his apologetic purposes, right? Everything that any human prophet or any human delegate has failed to do, Jesus has done, right? He has done perfectly. And that is precisely why his sacrifice for us is effective, right? Therefore, as Christians, we should have assurance of our salvation, right? And that assurance has little or nothing to do with our own confidence, right? With our own mental state, with our own feelings of our salvation. These things, the gospel is a one-time event, right? And we can have confidence in this because Jesus is fulfilling all of these roles simultaneously, right? Finally, to close off, when you read the Exodus narrative again, this is Exodus 4. Remember, Moses murders someone, right? He escapes to Midian, finds his wife, marries the daughter of a priest, and then the Lord visits him again, right? Do you remember this? The Lord visits him again. The Lord tells him, all those who are seeking your life are dead, right? This is what Matthew is referring to towards the end of the chapter. All those who are seeking the child's life are dead, right? So he spoke about this tension between the two political, the two kingdoms. On the one side, one political, the other one heavenly, the other one spiritual, the other one from God. Herod, in his attempt to prostrate himself as God, to prostrate himself as the controller of life and death, he himself has died, right? This is the irony that Matthew is trying to encapsulate. This is what is going on. And this is the extent to which the Lord will protect those who he loves, right? Those who he has plans for. This is divine justice. So if you remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, right? So the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, the king who constructs a massive bronze statue of himself and who tells his inhabitants to worship him, right? Nebuchadnezzar falls mentally ill towards the end of his reign, right? Almost humorously so. Humorously so. In likewise fashion, King Herod falls detrimentally ill towards the end of his life, probably due to some kind of a gastrointestinal, uncurable chronic disease. This is, you cannot, the Bible is clear through and through. You cannot prostrate yourself as God and not be judged for it, right? You'll always be judged for it. And this is why in places like 2 Samuel, this is why Jesus is the only one throughout the scriptures who is described as a king whose dynasty is eternal, right? Jesus has an eternal line, right? And this is something we should find hope in as Christians. So I'll end there. I'll pass around my notes. If there are any questions from the chapter, we can speak further in the group chat. That being said, I hope this was helpful. If there are any questions, if there are anything we didn't cover that you would like me to cover, we can definitely take a few minutes in next time session and cover that. For those who are curious, in verse 23, when Matthew says that he might be called a Nazarene, the word Nazarene does not occur anywhere else in the Bible. So what he's doing is in the same way that we discussed previously. Nazareth is this kind of unheard of town, right? Literally, it's in the Gospel of John, right? If you remember, when Nathanael is speaking with the disciples, Nathanael says, what good can come from Nazareth, right? He's shocked. And he grows up in a town less than 5 miles away from Nazareth. Nazareth is this unheard of town. So for it to host the Messiah, right? God incarnate, Matthew is essentially saying the entirety of Old Testament prophecy, especially in Zechariah and other places, it is necessary and it is according to the will of God that the Messiah comes from a town that no one has heard of, right? So no one can take credit for it. That's his point. So the fact that the word itself, Nazarene, does not occur anywhere else in the scriptures points to Matthew's deep understanding of Old Testament prophecy, right? Which would have prophesied a king as in Isaiah 49, right? As in Isaiah 53. This idea of the suffering servant, right? A servant who was rejected by his own people, right? Prophetically. This is what Matthew is trying to get across linguistically. So I'll end there. Hopefully that was helpful. I'll distribute this handout in the group. It has just some of the references we spoke about and then some of the, theological reflections. And then we'll cover Matthew 3 next time. I'll let you guys know about the dates and then I'll also pass around this recording. But if there are any questions, please feel free to let me know in here in the chat or otherwise I will stay. Otherwise, God bless you all. Thank you for chiming in and hopefully I can touch base with each of you individually sometime soon. So yeah, hopefully you guys are just aware of what we're trying to do project wise. I will be in the DMV consistently throughout the next few months or so just to do this in person. Work was a little tough this past week, but I do want our sessions to be in person moving forward. And I do want to reach those in my generation, right? So that's sort of what we have going on. Those in the DMV, those in the DC metro area need to hear the good news, and we're going to do it verse by verse. And beyond the Bible studies, we have some things planned as far as social events. I do want those in my generation to get married, this kind of thing. So we have a lot in the works, but we need support, right, for that to be a reality. So to the extent that you guys can keep this in mind, right? And not just for those who are my age, but also for your coworkers, right? We don't have time. We don't have time. By the time we get to Matthew 24 and 25, this will be super clear that we are in the end times. So we should be spreading the gospel as such, right? This is not about me. This is not about any pastor that's here. This is about the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? We need to be spreading the good news. This extends to neighbors, colleagues, to your children, right? Are you praying in front of your children, right? Are you living a kind of life that's consistent with the gospel, right? Is your allegiance clear? Like as we spoke about today, is it clear to your children and clear to the people in your lives that the kingdom of God is your number one, is where your loyalty lies? Or is it your job? Is it distractions? Is it even your marriage? Is it all these things which can get in the way of a healthy relationship with a holy God, right? I think these things are absolutely necessary for the health of the church and to make sure that our witness is effective, right, during these tough times. So I won't hold you guys any longer. Hopefully this was helpful. I'll pass around our notes. Yeah, we'll take it from there. I'll try to check in with all of you, and God bless you this weekend, this evening. And yeah, we'll be in touch. So let me know. My number is in the WhatsApp group if you don't have it already. Otherwise, I think a lot of you do have it. So just text me anytime. And I'll pass around this recording too, and hopefully chop it up into smaller pieces and just post it on social media. So that's planning wise what we have outside of the in-person stuff we're trying to get through. So yeah, God bless you guys. Have a good weekend. I'll stay for any questions, but you all are free to go. So yeah, have a good one. God bless. Any questions or are we good? Otherwise, I'll paste this recording in the chat in the WhatsApp group. Okay. Assumingly nothing. So God bless you and you know how to reach me. Does everyone here have the link tree, our website, in the WhatsApp group? If not, I can paste it, but hopefully you guys do. Okay. All right. God bless. See you. Bye.